Hello everyone, I am Alok Tongaonkar, one of the hosts for today's meetup. Welcome to today's talk on COVID-19 Conundrum, Critical Insights on Cloud Security Posture of Enterprises by Matt Chiodi, Chief Security Officer for Public Cloud for Palo Alto Networks. Before we start the talk, I would like to introduce the organizers of the talk, the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of ACM. This chapter was founded in 1957 with an aim to promote knowledge of modern computing, create community, support networking, and hiring. The annual membership is $20. Please consider joining by visiting SFBayACM.org. We organize 2 monthly meetings. The first is the General Computing talk on the 3rd Wednesday of the month. The second is Data Science SIG on the 4th Monday of the month. We also have joint meetings with other ACM groups, as well as with AICAM and ValleyML.ai. Here are our upcoming events. In the next 3 months, we will be showcasing special projects from Synopsys Science and Technology Championship 2021. First, we have on Monday, 24th May, a talk on a hybrid method to predict sports-related concussions with machine learning by Melody Yin, who's an 8th grade student at Harker and winner of the grand prize for the Synopsys Championship in the junior level. Next on Tuesday, June 22nd, we have Ray Summit 2021. This is a free virtual conference for scalable ML and Python. This is a joint event by SFBayACM and AICAM. Finally, on Monday, June 28th, we have 2 talks as part of Special Awards Winners Showcase from Synopsys 2021. One is on cardiovascular disease diagnosis by Christopher, Jay, and Millen from Monta Vista High School. The other is on an algorithm to determine eligibility for genetic screening of breast cancer leading to early identification by Disha and Tanvi from Harker. We also have the annual SFBayACM general election before these talks on the 28th of June. We would like all the active members and others who are interested to support us by joining for the election. Some logistics for today's meetings. Use Q&A in Zoom for questions to the speaker. Use chat on Zoom or YouTube for questions to the panelists. And announcements for job or other events can be posted in the comments section of the meetup page. It is my pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Matt Chiodi, who's the Chief Security Officer of Public Cloud at Palo Alto Networks. He currently leads the Unit 42 Cloud Threat Team at Palo Alto Networks. He came to Palo Alto Networks from cybersecurity startup Redlock, where he was the first Chief Information Security Officer. Prior to Redlock, he ran the global cloud security team, establishing internal security and governance standards for 260,000 plus employees at Cognizant, while later founding and managing its cloud security advisory services practices. So without further ado, I would like to hand it over to our speaker. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Alok. Thank you for the awesome introduction. Thank you for this opportunity to chat here with everyone from ACM. It looks like we've got some people joining from not just the US, but also outside the US. So welcome to this presentation. What I'm going to be talking about over the next number of minutes is some very recent cloud threat research. So let me share my screen, and then we will get started, and we will jump into this data. So, first of all, I think just listening to kind of the mission of ACM, I think there's some very interesting talks. So I encourage you to join and to look at some of those upcoming talks. I know I'm probably going to tune in for the one on the 24th, just because I'm really curious to hear an 8th grader talk about data sciences. And I think it was cardiovascular health or something related to that. So that might be more interesting than my talk, but I will do my best to make this interesting for you. So as Alok mentioned, in my role here at Palo Alto Networks as the Chief Security Officer of Public Cloud, one of the privileges that I have is leading the Unit 42 Cloud Threat Intelligence team. Unit 42 itself is a world-renowned brand for threat research. And Palo Alto has invested a lot in this over the last probably 7 to 10 years. And really, Unit 42 is now known as the preeminent brand when it comes to threat research. And what we've done over the last few years is dive really deep into cloud security, because this is an area that, prior to really Unit 42 diving into this, was an area that, quite frankly, wasn't covered very much. So while I didn't do the research that's in here, I have a team of researchers that are probably some of the most elite in the world. So thank you to them for putting this together and giving me the opportunity to really talk about it, so that organizations, as they consume this and as they move to cloud, can actually do better and understand some of the adversaries and the tactics that they're taking. So what we attempt to do in our cloud threat reports is, we put them out about every 6 months. And what we like to do is we try to pick an area of cloud security that is somewhat different from the last time we did the report. And we've been doing this report for about 3 years. And again, every 6 months they come out. In this report, we wanted to do something different. And that is, we wanted to try to quantify some of the impacts that COVID-19 has had on cloud security. Now, for the purposes of this report, we are talking about infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. We're not looking at SaaS. Okay, so this is all IaaS and PaaS data. If you want to download a full copy of the report, you can see the link at the bottom of the screen. But suffice it to say that, one of the things that, if you are looking at a lot of what is passed off as threat research in the industry, if you go to the methodology section, oftentimes you'll see that it's not actually really threat research. It ends up being surveys. So an organization, they send out surveys. What do you think? How do you feel? What do you intend to do? And then they call that threat research. Everything that we're going to cover over the next few minutes and everything you see in our threat reports are all based upon observable behavior from literally thousands of sensors all over the world. So this is real data, it's actionable. And what we attempted to do is to see what changed pre and post COVID-19 discovery. And so this data here spans from October of 2019 all the way through February of 2021. And it's really about deltas. So anytime you see percentages in here, it's looking at how things changed pre and post pandemic. So keep that in mind as we go through it. So why this topic? Well, obviously, COVID is something that has captured all of our attention over the last 14 or so months. But there was really 3 specific reasons that this topic was something that we felt like we really needed to dive into. And first and foremost, it comes down to the fact that, we suspected, as we started to move through the early parts of the pandemic and the early part of 2020, we suspected that there would be a rapid increase in cloud usage. But at the time, of course, we didn't have the data. But now that we are able to look back on it, we know that there was a massive cloud spend and scale that happened in response to the pandemic. So that was reason number 1. Reason number 2, and everybody knows this by now because most of us are probably still working from home, is that the percentage of employees working remotely jumped massively. So Pew Research said that pre-pandemic, the number of Americans working from home was right around 20%. At the height of the lockdowns, that number hit 71%. So anytime you have that much of an increase, it's bound to cause issues when it comes to security. And so this is the second reason that we decided to really go deep into this topic, because we knew anytime you change human behaviors that critically, the way people work that quickly, there's bound to be challenges when it comes to security. And then the last area, this one's near and dear to my heart. And of course, everyone knows what's probably happened in the last 24 to 48 hours with Ethereum and Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. But we've talked about the connection between cryptocurrencies, cryptojacking, and cloud for a number of years now. And we actually found some correlations. And the other thing is as the pandemic raged, cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Monero, they all grew in popularity and market value. These really were kind of the presuppositions of why we wanted to dig deep into this topic. Again, if you have questions as we go through this, you can pop them either into the chat. If they're on YouTube, I think Alok is going to put them into Alok will put them into the question, and I will check those from time to time. So again, if you have questions, feel free to pop those into the chat. I will check on those every once in a while, and we'll go from there. So one of the things that I think many people don't realize about cloud is that from an infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, cloud spending up until the pandemic had actually been on a multi-quarter decline. You heard me right, multi-quarter decline. And you can see, we're just showing a snapshot of it here starting in Q4 of 2019, but you can see it had actually been going down. Now, it's still healthy growth, right? It's still in that 30, high 20% range, but it had actually been on a multi-quarter decline. But you can see that change. And that's what we attempted to overlay here with the data. You can see the red dots at the bottom of the screen, and you can really see how in reaction to that, organizations really started to move started to move workloads to the cloud. So in Q4 of 20, enterprise spending on cloud infrastructure services were just over $37 billion. That's $4 billion higher than the previous quarter and up 35% from the fourth quarter of 2019. So we now know, looking back, that there was a massive amount of cloud spend. So the cloud spend, that's the green line. Now the blue line, that is cloud security incidents, and we overlaid it. And what's interesting, and there's a couple ways, I guess, to interpret this data, is that surge in cloud security incidents, it actually preceded the growth in cloud workloads in terms of spend. Now, there's a couple ways to interpret that. One could be is this potentially attackers being opportunistic, going out and looking for misconfigurations, which are very common in cloud environments. We'll talk a lot more about that. Or is it just the fact that there was a delay because spending is not always reported right away? Either way, you can see that there was a disproportional increase in the number of cloud security incidents. And we'll go a lot more into that as we get further through the slides. Now, the other thing I want to call out is, and I mentioned this a minute ago, is, we've been doing this cloud threat research for a number of years now. And one thing that we have seen consistently over the years is that misconfigurations tend to dominate the issues and challenges that organizations have from a security and compliance perspective. And certainly what we found in this report is really no different, except that there was a rapid acceleration. And some of the things that we saw being misconfigured were a little bit different than what we saw before. So let me share this with you. So as you can see, here are some of the most common misconfigurations we see in public cloud platforms. There's some good news here, and I guess this is one way to look at it, is that if you look at number one and number three on there, we saw a rapid increase in the utilization of PaaS-based databases. So think of Azure SQL, AWS Redshift, and that's a good thing from a security perspective because you no longer have to manage, for example, patching and versioning of those PaaS-based services. The downside, of course, or it's just one of those things that you have to be able to operationalize, is the fact that you still have to manage the configuration of those PaaS-based services. So what we're seeing from a risk perspective is that unencrypted SQL databases, they exploded. Okay, they absolutely exploded by over a 2x factor. We saw a 212% increase in unencrypted SQL databases. And you can notice there's commonality, right? So if you look between number one and number three, unencrypted databases increased the database itself, as well as the actual snapshots of those databases. And so, there's a number of challenges here with unencrypted databases. Number one is, the assumption is that if you have a database, it's highly likely to have some type of sensitive data in it, whether it's personally identifiable information or whether it's intellectual property. If it falls especially into that first category of being PII, well, then there is a litany of cloud compliance and regulations that require that the data be encrypted, from GDPR globally or even CCPA in California. And that's just two of them that are local, I think, for most audiences that are probably hearing this, but there's a slew of other ones that require encryption. So these two things just show that organizations are really struggling with some of the basics when it comes to securing cloud platforms. Now, you've noticed in the middle that we saw malicious port scans also almost double, up 185%, again, compared to pre-COVID and post-COVID-19 discovery, almost double. We think this is that opportunistic nature that we are talking about when it comes to attackers. They know, right? We know from our previous research, from looking at almost 18 months worth of cloud breaches, that 65% of security incidents in the cloud are the result of customer misconfigurations. You heard me right. 65% of cloud security incidents are the result of customer misconfigurations. And we're seeing that trend, unfortunately, continue, and COVID rapidly accelerated it. If I had to kind of put a bottom line on this data, it would be this. Organizations did a really good job moving workloads to the cloud in response to the pandemic, but they did a poor job in terms of automating the security and compliance controls around those workloads. The downside of this is that when you move workloads to the cloud, there should not be a disproportionate increase in cloud security incidents. If anything, it should be proportional, or if you've done your automation correct, it should be inversely correlated. But we're not seeing that. And the impact of this is that as you move more and more workloads to the cloud and you haven't automated your security and compliance controls, it ends up almost always overwhelming the security operations team. They're the ones that almost always bear the brunt of all that additional signal that is traditionally being generated. Let's look at some regional data. One of the things that we did do differently in this report is we wanted to really kind of slice the data both regionally and also from an industry perspective. So I want to walk you through both of those, because I'm sure with the audience that we have listening today, you'll either probably be more interested in one region or industry than another. And again, what I'm covering here in the presentation today is only just an excerpt of the data that is in the full report. And if you don't have the link, I have a link at the end. You can download it, or you can now just go to cloudthreat.report and just put that in a browser. That will take you to our latest edition of the Cloud Threat Report. Again, cloudthreat.report, and it'll take you to the most recent cloud threat research. And I'm sure you can also find on there links to some of our other threat reports as well. From a regional perspective, and this was showed, I guess, on another way of looking at some of the cloud spend, is we saw fairly uniform growth in cloud workloads across all regions. You can see that the APAC region was the leader, and then Japan came in last in terms of its growth. Now, we call out Japan specifically, not because they're a laggard at 58%, but simply because we know from doing the research over the last few years that Japan does tend to be a laggard in terms of how they've adopted cloud. And this shows in both the numbers. There's multiple studies that have showed this. What's really interesting about this is that sometimes there's actually benefits to taking a more programmatized and more thoughtful approach to adopting cloud. And the reason I say this, that sometimes it pays to grow slowly, is because of this type of statistic. Here's what we found. We found that about a third of Japanese organizations had insecure network configurations. And this could mean various different things, right? So just to be fair, this could mean if somebody has 100 workloads and 100 traditional VMs running in their cloud account, if they have one that has a promiscuous configuration, for example, it's allowing, TCP, UDP on any port into at least one of their virtual machines, it's going to show up in this list. Now, in my view, you shouldn't have any. That's one of those misconfigurations that should just never exist in your cloud environments. And it's one of those things that should be just completely automated away. But in this case here, we're seeing this 32% of the time. 32% of the time, they're having these types of insecure network configurations. Now, you might be thinking, that's really high, right? A third of Japanese organizations have some type of insecure network configuration. And why are you saying that it pays to grow slowly? Well, the reason why is when you compare Japan to the rest of the globe, they actually look really good. Because we found 60% of organizations, excluding Japan, had a similar insecure network configuration, right? 60%. So you can see that by a pretty good factor, Japanese organizations, because of their slow growth approach to consuming cloud, it actually results in a much better security profile, at least from a network security perspective. Now, another way to look at this is if you look more specifically around like what ports are being exposed, we found that only 39% of Japanese organizations expose port 22 SSH on at least one of their cloud hosts. And in comparison, that number was about 58% of organizations worldwide that exposed port 22. So again, there's still some massive variance, and it just shows that, being first to the cloud is not always the best thing. One of the other areas that I think is very, very interesting and very important to look at is the fact that we have consistently also looked at in terms of what are the actual services that organizations are exposing publicly to the internet. And that's important because not all services are created equal. One of the most pressing reasons to pay attention to RDP security is ransomware. And it's commonly deployed through RDP exploits. Now, with the Colonial Pipeline attack here in the Northeast, where I am, this is something that I believe is top of mind for many organizations. They're very concerned about ransomware. And what I say is that if you are very concerned about ransomware, as you should be, you need to be very cognizant of the RDP exposure that your organization has, both on-premise, but especially in the cloud. We found that, again, almost a third, about 27% of organizations have it exposed, rather a 27% increase in RDP exposure. And this is not looking at one cloud service provider. This is across really the big four that we're primarily looking at here. So you can see that, or employees are working remotely. Maybe somebody's in DevOps, and normally they would go through their traditional CI process in order to make changes, but perhaps they went in and they temporarily brought something up. They've exposed it and it never got brought down. That could be one of the reasons that this number is up so highly. Now, here's some external research. This is from our colleagues over at ESET Security. What they found in their Q4 threat report, they found there was almost an 8-fold increase in RDP attacks between Q1 and Q4 last year. So this is something that, attackers are very, very well aware of, and they are looking to actively exploit these types of attacks. So it's really important to know what your attack surface looks like, both from the inside out, as well as from the outside in. Again, just to remind everybody, if you have questions, either about the data, how we collected it, or just about the research in general, feel free to put that in. If you're on the Zoom, you can put those in the Zoom chat. We will answer those as we go. Or if you're on YouTube, you can drop those into the comments section, and then we will get those answered as well. So RDP remains a persistent vector. Now, when you look at this from a region perspective, you can see that unfortunately, our friends up north in Canada, they did win this prize of having the most publicly exposed RDP. This is not something that you really want to win. When I'm talking to my Canadian colleagues, I usually say stick to hockey and really do a better job at reducing your exposure of RDP remotely. You can see the global average is right around about 51%. You can see that's really where the US sits and the UK as well. And again, you can see Japan, right down there at 38%. Again, moving slowly sometimes has its benefits when there is a programmatized approach behind it. Well, let's look at some industry specific intelligence. I think this is, again, helpful. So if you are, in pharma, if you're in life sciences, there's definitely some data in here that I think you will find interesting. And again, this is a highlight of the data that's in the report. I think the report's probably 17 pages. And if I tried to cover that all here, it'd probably take a couple hours. So hopefully this is enough to whet your appetite that you will want to read the full report, which the team has worked really hard on. So, looking at industries, there's some really interesting findings here. And that is, number one, you can see chemical manufacturing. Again, this is not a security slide. Okay. This is looking at cloud workload growth. Who experienced the greatest growth pre and post COVID-19 discovery? Chemical manufacturing and government really kind of came in neck and neck, as well as pharma and life sciences. You can see the global average is actually right around 23%. Wholesale and insurance pulling up the third and fourth increase. Now, while I think this is interesting is because when you think about COVID-19, what are some of the interest in the industries that are probably the most important? Right? Yes, chemical manufacturing, government, pharma and life sciences. These are the organizations that had the largest growth in cloud workloads. Now, this is important because what you're going to see on the next slide is how does this look in relation to cloud security incidents? So remember this picture. Now look at this next slide. Now, I highlighted the top four there. You can see there is some commonality with the stark exception of retail. So if you look at the full report, I actually don't remember what the statistic is around retail's workload growth, but certainly retail, the likes of Amazon, et cetera, cloud is nothing new to them. They've been in the cloud for a very long time, and they likely had to scale their workloads, but not nearly as much as what we saw here back on the previous slide with chemical manufacturing, government, and pharma, which are probably some of the most regulated industries. And that also tends to mean that their cloud adoption is slower, but they had literally no option when it came to the pandemic. They had to move to the cloud and they had to scale their workloads. So this trend, in my view, it's not surprising, right? These are industries that were among those facing the greatest pressures to adapt and scale in the face of the pandemic. Retailers for basic necessities and manufacturing and government for COVID-19 supplies and aid. Now, retail, it's somewhat interesting, right? Why would they go, if they didn't really scale their cloud usage so greatly, why would they jump by 4x? A couple ways to look at this could be, or just one way maybe, is the fact that, retail prior to the pandemic really wasn't considered critical infrastructure. But especially during the lockdowns, you had a large percentage of those around the world who now all of a sudden relied upon online infrastructure via retail to get their basic necessities. So that could be one thing that explains it, how hackers are targeting these systems, and perhaps even retail being well-versed in cloud, perhaps just the scale and the quickness of the scale might have been something that they perhaps weren't even ready for. That could explain this massive increase in incidents for retail. Bottom line for all of these industries, and I will note that when we looked across the industries, I think we go into some more detail of this in the report. The only industry that we actually found that didn't grow their workloads was oil and gas. And as everybody knows, there was a massive economic contraction, and they are almost always one of the first that takes the hit. So oil and gas was the only one that actually showed a contraction around this. Bottom line for all of these industries, is that these incidents expanded cloud environments attack surfaces and made security auditing and forensic efforts more difficult. One of the other things that we looked at in this report was just if we compared certain industries to others, which ones do better than others, and which controls are perhaps more important to one industry versus another. Now, we don't go through kind of all the industries simply because, one of the questions that I often get is why don't you include, this industry or that industry? And the simple answer is where we did not have sufficient samples, we did not include them in the report. If we found that, we only had a handful, we felt that it wasn't statistically relevant and we didn't include it. So whatever industries you do see referenced in the report, those are, again, ones that we felt like we had a large enough statistical sample so that it was an accurate representation of the industry itself. So if you look at these 4 or 5 industries here, there's a couple things that stand out. And I'll call you first to look at the blue line references logging. And most of this is in reference to cloud storage logging, which for many organizations continues to be a persistent challenge. So the blue line represents, do you have logging controls enabled? Do you have logs enabled? And that might sound like a very basic thing, but we have seen in past research that organizations struggle with just turning logging on. Something as simple as that. So this is what this is looking at. Do they have logging controls turned on for each and every one of their cloud storage containers? That's the blue line. The red line refers to access key and access key rotation. Are they following best practices and rotating their access keys every 90 days? Maybe for some of you who aren't as familiar with access keys, they're different from usernames and passwords because they tend to be used for machine-to-machine communication, usually through APIs, and they cannot be as easily secured with multi-factor authentication. So it becomes all the more important that the access keys are rotated on a regular basis. So that's the red line, and then the yellow or the chrome line, that is versioning. And that's really important because if you suffer a ransomware attack against your cloud storage and you don't have versioning enabled, it makes it difficult, if not impossible, to roll back changes and get back to the last known good version of those files. So these are really just 3 critical controls that we looked at. And what I'll call your attention to here is just a few of these industries. Number one, if you look at telecommunications is one of those heavily regulated industries that when they tend to do something, they usually have a formula for it. It's usually programmatized. And you can see here that telecommunications, long time been part of critical infrastructure here in the US. You can see that about 66% of organizations have enabled access logging controls, or rather versioning to all of their cloud storage. And this is just really important. So they prioritize data recovery. Now, when you look at, for example, the media industry, they have very different priorities. So you can see here that about 40% of all media organizations globally have applied some type of logging controls to each and every cloud storage container. Now, if you contrast that with retail organizations, you can see the number is really very different, right? Only 25% of retail organizations did the same thing. Now, we don't necessarily know why there are some rapid divergences here, right? So if you look at the telecommunications industry, you can see that they don't really do in fact, compared to all the other industries here, they actually do a pretty poor job rotating their access keys. And then if you look at what the media industry is doing, they do actually a pretty good job. Now, we theorize that the reason why media organizations tend to be better at this is that they are very particular about access to their content. That is their primary revenue stream, especially considering the consequences of the Sony Pictures hack back in 2014. Oftentimes, negative events, painful events like that, do lead to future better behavior. And we certainly see that with the media industry. We looked also in this report at the type of data that organizations are entrusting to cloud service providers, because as everyone knows, there's this shared responsibility model. And while you get to outsource certain responsibilities to the cloud service provider, you can never outsource the accountability. And as soon as you put data into a cloud service provider, immediately you have more responsibility. And so we looked at what type of data. And before we talk about the type of the data, there is good news. This is not all negative news. I think there's actually two pieces of good news in this report. This is the first one, is that we surveyed quite a bit amount of cloud storage. And what we found is that about only 0.1% of the cloud storage that we surveyed contained malware. So that's really good information. And I think it has something to do with the fact that when you have centralized cloud storage, it becomes much easier to scan it and to remediate when there is malware types of things found. Because if you think about a traditional enterprise that has traditional storage, it's in 1,000 different locations, it becomes really hard to scan that. But when you have it in the cloud, you can point your tools to one specific data source and you can get it all in one shot. We're very close to that. So I think that's why we're seeing this number so low at 0.1%. When we drill into that 0.1%, what we find is that the vast majority of the malware is targeted at Windows executables. And this is consistent with what we see in terms, if we look at sites like VirusTotal, et cetera. So this is common. When we look at the actual data that organizations are putting into cloud environments, we know that cloud is no longer being used for edge cases, for things that are, low risk. They are fully trusting the cloud with all types of sensitive data. And we found that about 64% of data that's deployed in the cloud is sensitive. Now, when we say sensitive, there's really two categories that, at least from our research, that we found. The first is that just about under 70% contains personally identifiable information. The other chunk tends to be some type of intellectual property. This is why when we talk about some of the previous things we talked about with data security and some of the challenges, it becomes really important to understand the type of data you have in the cloud, how it's being accessed, and who is accessing it. This is a critical thing to understand. And I would say that most organizations don't have a good handle on this. So on top of having misconfigurations such as those that we've talked about, they are also struggling with knowing what type of data they have. This was one shocking finding for us, this 30%. So how many of you remember, if you go back, 14, 18 months ago, what was in the news about every 2 weeks? It was, what was it? It was some type of cloud storage bucket that was publicly exposed, right? Some researcher found it, or somebody that wasn't a researcher found it. He ended up on the cover of the New York Times. It was very, very common. All the news of the pandemic kind of tamped down that news. And I think there was some improvements that the cloud service providers made to try to better warn their users. But in our research, we found that still 30% of organizations are allowing some type of public access to their sensitive data. This is shocking because it means that anyone who knows the right URLs can access the data without passwords or any other type of authentication. This is not good news. All right, so I promised that we would talk about the connection between COVID, cloud, and cryptocurrencies. This chart, mind you, is old. Yes, it needs to be updated. I don't know where Bitcoin ended today. Not that it ever ends, right? It trades 24/7, but certainly for much of the pandemic, it traded way above 20,000. Last time I looked today, I think it was closer to 40. But you can really see that when the pandemic was declared by the WHO, it really sent Bitcoin, and not just Bitcoin, but a lot of the other cryptocurrencies soaring. And anytime you have this type of price action, it is almost always going to lead those who are nefarious to look for ways that they can profit from it. And we certainly saw this as we went through the pandemic. Now, most people who are not threat researchers, they're familiar with Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, Dash, Dogecoin, not a coin that I like, by the way, Bitcoin, right? So those are some of the very common kind of household coins. What many are not familiar with is Monero or XMR. That's the blue line on the chart. XMR is Monero. Monero is a privacy coin. If you don't want to be tracked, if you're perhaps a nefarious type, this is your go-to coin. It's almost always done with Monero. People like to say that Bitcoin is used for that, but Bitcoin is way too public and way too traceable for a lot of this. Most people are going with something like Zcash or Monero. We tend to see Monero be the favorite of cryptojackers. So what you're looking at here is the total mining connections. And the blue line again is Monero, and all those other lines below it, those are the common cryptocurrencies. So XMR mining connections, they significantly outperformed all of the other currency mining operations, which if you look at, again, the Bitcoins, the Litecoins, Ethereum, they combine for an average of only 1% of total network connections taken by Monero. So Monero absolutely dominates. And again, this is all public cloud. This is not looking at anything on premise. This is all public cloud. The reason that you should care about this is because due to the inefficiency in cloud-based CPUs and GPUs in the mining operations, there's actually a negative cost-benefit ratio. So any network connections that you see to these mining pools from enterprise cloud infrastructure should really be considered highly suspicious. You really shouldn't have any of this in your environment unless you are testing. Now, don't read too much into this chart. This was something that we did for perhaps a little bit of fun. And the red line is mining connections. This is all XMR, and it is only looking at a 90-day period. On the bottom axis, you can see that we tried to map some of the significant events from the coronavirus pandemic. And I guess just a couple things that I can call out. I'll let you, when you download the full report, you can kind of geek out on it and go much deeper into it. But if you look at a couple of things here, again, what we're trying to do here is just map and try to figure out, was there any possible correlations between COVID and XMR mining, at least in this 90-day period? And, what I want you to remember is that those that are actually doing this crypto mining, they are humans just like you and me, right? They feel and they can sense fear. If you look at January 29th, there was a huge spike in mining activity right before J&J started to talk publicly about their single dose vaccine. It was the first of its kind. We can't know for sure, but perhaps they were feeling like their opportunity to mint coins might be slipping away, so they amped up their mining activity. And you can see that massive spike that happened there. And yet, just a few days after J&J submitted for FDA approval, the connections had massively dropped. Now, we can suspect here that maybe they felt like their opportunity to mine coins was slipping away, or they wanted to take a profit. But it does seem that, although the amount of data that we had to work with here was limited to this 90-day period, it's not possible to draw 100% definitive conclusions, but it does appear likely that political and health-related events exerted a clear impact on malicious crypto mining operations, at least for Monero or XMR. Now, I mentioned that there was two pieces of good news in this report. So this is the second piece, in that we have been tracking cryptojacking in the cloud for the better part of almost 4 years now. And the good news is that we actually recorded the first drop in cryptojacking since we started doing this back in 2018. So just if you look at the middle part of 2020, that number is about 23% of organizations globally were experiencing some type of cryptojacking activity, and that's a massive number. And that number has now dropped to 17%. Again, this is a 90-day windows that we're looking at. We will continue to track this. Hopefully, it will continue on that downward trend. Now, this is the part of the presentation where people they're starting to wonder, well, how do I defend against these things? It seems like there's a lot of misconfigurations. It sounds like, attackers are still leveraging those misconfigurations to do all types of things, cryptojacking, et cetera. How do I actually defend against it? Well, I can tell you that probably the best way to do it is by investing in automating the security and governance of your cloud workloads. Now, there's many names that this goes by, right? There's been much talk in the industry around shift left, DevSecOps, but I think this is an area that organizations have massively underinvested in, or they just simply don't know how to get there. This picture, I think, is a very good picture of what many cloud environments look like. They might be scaling, but from a security and compliance perspective, they are rapidly deteriorating. Here's another way to look at it. I love this picture. It is very peaceful. I'm sure we can all think of a place like this, but when you're looking at a body of water and it's just absolutely still, what happens if you take a pebble and you throw it in the water? There is just this ripple effect, right? Where now all of a sudden you had calm water, and now all of a sudden there's these ripples in it. This is where I think this picture represents where most organizations are in their cloud journey. Now, maybe your organization is born on the cloud, and maybe this is not a good analogy for you, but for the vast majority of enterprises, this little kind of ripple in the water represents where they are today in their cloud journey. And this was really kind of driven home for me when I pulled this quote that I found from Andy Jassy, which is just from about 2 months ago. He said that less than 5% of global IT spend is in the cloud as of today. Less than 5%. And obviously that's going to change a lot in the near future. The reason that this is important is that if we're only at 5% and organizations are struggling with the misconfigurations that we've talked about now in this report plus other reports, it is scary to think what could be if they don't make the right investments and if they don't follow the right frameworks to get there. Because we're never going to get to 100%. I don't even know if we'll get to 50%, right? Because there will always be an on-prem, there will always be campuses and things like that. But even if we go from 5 to 20% in the next few years, that is a massive, massive growth rate. So how do you do this? Well, one of the things that we developed at Palo Alto Networks is our Big Cloud 5 framework. And you can think of the Big Cloud 5 really as patterns of excellence. Each one of these are focus areas that are absolutely critical to building a holistic cloud security program. And I won't spend a lot of time on these simply because this is a talk in and of itself. If you want more information to read about it, you can go to the link at the bottom of your screen. But number one for us always starts with visibility. You've got to know what assets you have in the cloud, and you have to be able to continually maintain that, both in terms of these are the known assets, these are my known cloud accounts, but then you also have to be cognizant of the unknowns. Now you're thinking, how can I be aware of something that's an unknown? Well, there are tools that are available that can help you understand what your attack surface looks like and also do the attribution for you. I'm not going to talk about products here, but you can find something on our website. But you have to be able to understand the knowns and secure those, and then also the unknowns, and then bring them under management. So you got to have that deep cloud visibility into the assets that you have and the changes that are occurring in those assets, because cloud assets do change much more frequently than those in on-premise environments. So number one, get and maintain deep cloud visibility. Number two has to do with setting guardrails or security guardrails. I think AWS has done a really good job talking about this and coming up with frameworks over the last number of years. But for many organizations, moving to security guardrails really represents a mindset shift. And what I mean by that is that when you're operating in an on-prem world where you have the four walls of the data center around you, you've got a nice hard exterior shell, you lose that when you go to the cloud. You lose the visibility, and you really have to be more proactive in how you are looking for common misconfigurations, such as those that we've talked about in this report. So this requires you to think in terms of anti-patterns. What are the misconfigurations that should never exist in our cloud environments? And you out and you hunt for those automatically. And then when you find them, such as open cloud storage buckets, databases receiving traffic directly from the internet, et cetera, when you find those, you automatically correct them. So that's what I mean in terms of thinking as security guardrails. The third area has to do with standards. And I know standards sound really boring, but they are absolutely critical to scaling your cloud infrastructure, both just from a resilience and availability perspective, but also from a security and compliance perspective. Now, there are many good standards out there. The Center for Internet Security has their CIS benchmarks. I know they just released V8, the critical controls. I recommend starting there as well. But standards are important because they are the precursor to automation. Number 4 has to do with the people side of the house. And this is what we really mean is that, many security teams don't have software engineers on their team, or they don't have anybody with a software engineering background. And I'm not saying you need to go out and hire a team of software engineers to come work on your security team. But what I am talking about is making sure that you have a capability within your team of at least perhaps 1 or 2 individuals. It depends upon the size of your organization that understand how development pipelines work. And this is really critical because in order to do the 5th, and I won't call it the final step, but in order to get to this embedded security, really shift left and DevSecOps, you have to have all the pieces from people, process, and technology. I work with a lot of organizations and they are struggling to do number 1, but they're trying to do number 5. It's very difficult to do 5 if you haven't worked on and don't have a plan for all of the steps in between. So that is the end of the content and the end of the talk. If there are questions that you did not want to ask while I was talking, you can drop those questions in the chat. Or if you are bold and you want to come off mute, I think we can allow that as well. But certainly if you want to put it in the chat, either in YouTube or in our Zoom, we will answer those questions now. So feel free to put those questions in the chat. While you're doing that, I will encourage you to go to this link here, cloudthreat.report. You actually don't have to go to the 1H21, just the naked URL will take you right to the latest report. If you want to hear more about our cloud threat research and really just the how side of cloud security, how to operationalize cloud security, what are the latest cloud threats, I would encourage you to subscribe to the podcast Cloud Security Today. You can just go to cloudsecuritytoday.com. You can find it in any one of the popular apps from the Apple Podcast, on Android, Stitcher, Overcast, available on all those platforms. You can check out Cloud Security Today. All right, we'll wait another couple seconds here to see if any questions come in. But if not, we will call it a day. Seems that we have a quiet group, so I've appreciated everybody joining today. And if you have questions, maybe you think of it after the fact, you can certainly send those in, and we will attempt to get those. We will attempt to get those answered for you. All right, that's all that I have. Look, I don't know if there's anything else we want to do from our side, but if not, thank you for joining. Look, anything from your side?
Yeah, thank you, Matt, for this very interesting talk. And we have some announcements. Liana?
Thank you for coming and give a talk at this time. And we have some new things coming up, specifically for Synopsys special award winners give us presentations in the next 3 months, May, June, and July. So those are very young little kids and doing very well in this competitions. We like to give them a platform, let them to practice in public speech as well. And some of the kids actually already doing teachings at their middle school. So welcome for anybody to bring your own kids to take a look in the next 3 months for our programming. Now, thank you for Matt. I'm really enjoy your talking. Hopefully we can see something more interesting. And hopefully if some of the data, can you give to us for the student to do a hackathon on that?
That would be interesting. We'll have to look at doing that. Yeah, potentially we could do that. Let's let's chat with a look and we'll see what we can do.
Okay, good, great. Yes, thank you.
Thank you for having me on. It was fun.
Okay, Alok, you taking over?
Yeah, I think I would like to thank all the audience for joining. I know this time we had the meeting early because Matt is joining from East Coast. So thank you all for taking the time to join the meeting. And with that, I would like to end the meeting. Thank you.